Well, good evening again, and welcome once again to our series on these five sessions on the Gospel of John. I hope everybody's well, and that nobody turned up an hour late for their service this morning. The series is called Life Stories, and each session is related to a question which is asked in the Gospel itself. And each of the sessions begins with an illustration from contemporary life. Life is the theme of the whole thing. And my story from real life this week is second-hand. It's a story that I heard at a conference of Christian broadcasters, something I used to do, told by one of my broadcasting heroes, Dr. Pauline Webb, whom some of you may be familiar with. A Methodist. Actually, she was vice president of the World Council of Churches for a time. Many of you will have heard of her anyway, or heard her presenting religious programs on radio and television and offering some of the very best thoughts for the day. She's one of my broadcasting heroes, or I suppose I should say heroines, and her death in 2017 was a great loss. This story that she told concerns a conversation she had with Michael Burke after he returned from reporting on the Ethiopian famine, the so-called famine of biblical proportions. I'm sure many of you can picture him standing there in front of this huge refugee camp talking about a famine of biblical proportions, which gave birth to Band-Aid and all sorts of other initiatives. It was quite a landmark broadcast. On their filming day, Pauline said, the crew filmed all morning and then it was time for lunch. Very seldom is there no food at all available in the camps. It's just too expensive for the people to buy, or indeed the people have no money at all and simply wait for a general distribution of meals. But on this day, the crew went into what passed for a store to buy lunch, and they bought all the bread they had, which was very little. But then crews are generally hungry people. As they sat to eat, they were aware of being surrounded by dozens of pairs of wide eyes from children and adults for whom the simple everyday task of going to a store to buy bread was an almost forgotten dream. Hungry eyes, pleading eyes. No one approached the crew. And then, said Michael Burke, a strange thing happened. Without eating anything themselves, one by one, the crew broke their bread into many pieces and gave a piece to everyone nearby to them. I found that quite a moving story, and I wonder how that felt for the people, how it felt, perhaps more importantly, for the crew. It was never going to cure the people's hunger, but the dilemma facing the crew was the same as that found from the source of that quote, which is John chapter 6. Now, chapter 6 is long. It's 71 verses long, and when it appears in our Sunday lectionary, it seems to stay there endlessly, often apparently repeating itself, and it's very frustrating because people week after week think, I'm sure I heard this last week. And we hear it in such small bits that it's difficult to get the big picture. So let's start with looking at the big picture of the structure of that particular chapter. Basically, there are three scenes. The first takes place in the hills on the far side of the Sea of Galilee. And this is the setting for the way the chapter begins, with John's account of the feeding of the 5,000, which for John is a sign. John never uses the word miracle. Perhaps I think it maybe summons up for him ideas of some kind of conjuring trick, which might fascinate people for a while, but have little lasting value. The question is never, how did Jesus do that? But is always, what does this tell us about Jesus? We know about John's strategy. It's one we must always keep in mind from chapter 20. He's writing for a purpose, and that purpose is to follow the signs that he describes, so that we might come to believe in Jesus and so achieve life in all its abundance in his name. Jesus is often critical of people who draw the wrong conclusions from the signs. So that's the first scene. The second scene is a brief interlude which takes place on the sea itself that evening and the following morning. And here John again reminds us of a synoptic account, Matthew, Mark, Luke, the synoptic gospels, as he describes Jesus walking on the water. He also uses this interlude to continue one of his favourite themes, which is that people seek after Jesus, but sometimes he makes it difficult for them to find him. The third and longest scene takes place on the near shore in the synagogue in Capernaum. And here Jesus is depicted as teaching, essentially teaching about the significance of the feeding sign. One scholar describes this as a dialogue sermon, but it's nothing like a dialogue sermon I've ever been part of. It sounds more like a raucous free-for-all, to be honest, in which Jesus is constantly interrupted and heckled, and people saying things like, well, I'm not listening to this rubbish anymore, and leaving. This section includes the enigmatic statement, by Jesus, I am the bread of life. The climax, though, centres on one person with a very different view who doesn't want to leave, but rather wants to stay and to say that he believes, and that person is Peter. In the other Gospels, we hear Peter make a similar confession at a place called Caesarea Philippi, but here it doesn't lead to any further discussion. There's no the only comparison to be made is with those who are leaving. And so in comparison with them, it comes across as a sincere act of commitment. Peter, and presumably Peter speaking on behalf of the other disciples, says, your words are words of eternal life. We believe and know that you are God's Holy One. And that's how, more or less, how the chapter ends. So let's take a little closer look into that first scene, the one from which our question today is taken. How can we buy bread for these people? It's a question that Jesus asks, but John tells us it's a trick question. Like the other signs, this one is packed with allusions and references, which the original reader would have picked up. We need to have kind of pointed out to us. There are three kinds of reference. The first is to the story of the Exodus, the story of the foundation narrative of the people of Israel, who were brought from slavery to the freedom of a new society, and potentially a new kind of society. John's very interested in beginnings, just as he references creation itself in his first chapter. So the formation of a society of God's faithful people is one he wants us to keep in view. Where is that referenced? Well, first of all, the account actually begins with the words, the Passover was drawing near. Now, why on earth should he say that? I mean, when they're stuck in the middle of the far side of the Sea of Galilee on a hillside. And that's often overlooked, that comment. It seems irrelevant. But if we think for a moment of what happens in the Synoptic Gospels when Passover is drawing near, immediately where our thoughts are with the Last Supper, which was a Passover meal, itself turned into a feeding sign as the occasion for the institution of what would become the Eucharist. And indeed, there's a further clue that we might be drawn to that particular account at the very end of chapter 6, where there's a reference to Judas betraying Jesus. Throughout the chapter, there's lots of references to manna in the wilderness, very much an Exodus theme. At one point, Jesus goes up a mountain alone, which reminds us of Moses going up the mountain to get the Ten Commandments and so on. And as part of the account, Jesus crosses a sea, and he does so for no real apparent reason. And then he crosses back again from outside Israel back into Israel. So all of those things would remind people of the Exodus account. Then secondly, if, as I believe, this gospel is written for people who are familiar with the Synoptic Gospels, elements of this chapter may well remind them of the temptation stories. John doesn't have the temptation stories where we expect them to be right at the beginning of his gospel. But here, as in one of the temptations, Jesus is tempted to rule. In verse 15, it says, Jesus, realizing that they meant to come and seize him to proclaim him king, withdrew again to the hills by himself. In the temptation, one of the things the devil does is says, I can give you sovereignty over all these countries of the earth. But Jesus turns him down. And in John's Gospel, when he's aware that the crowd are tempted in this way, or perhaps are tempting him in this way, or that's the way they see him, he withdraws to the hills by himself. Another of temptations is about bread in the wilderness, turning stones into bread. And that could be the theme, if you like, of the whole section, really, that culminates in, I am the bread of life. In this account, as one commentator notes, Jesus is both bread and word, and could be offering a reflection on the synoptic accounts, where Jesus reminds people of what Deuteronomy says about not living by bread alone, but by every word that comes from God. Here, bread and word are connected in his person. So those are two things that would be referenced in the minds of those who are reading this for the first time. But the third is undoubtedly the main thing that readers would be reminded of, and that would be the Eucharist. In the Synoptic Gospels, as we know, this is instituted at the Last Supper, with a description and words that we repeat at every service. When John describes the Last Supper, he makes no mention at all of the institution of the Eucharist. Instead, he concentrates on Jesus washing the disciples' feet. And commentators generally, if they're thinking about John and the Eucharist, are more inclined to see the wine at the wedding of Cana in chapter 2, and here in chapter 6, which is mostly about bread, as being the foundation for the Eucharist in John. It's best read, I think, this chapter as a reflection on something that people are already familiar with, people who are already part of a Eucharistic celebration. The key statement, and this is the third time I've said it, is, I am the bread of life. And Jesus says that the bread he will give for the life of the world will be his flesh. And that proves to be the most controversial thing he says. This bread is definitely identified as the bread of the Eucharist. There's no question about that. In verse 23, the Gospel says, boats had come ashore near the place where the people had eaten the bread over which the Lord gave thanks. The phrase over which thanks was given is just one word in Greek, Eucharistisantos, or in modern Greek, Eucharistisantos. And you notice in that word that it's an elongation of the word Eucharist. It's undoubtedly the bread of the Eucharist. This could be translated literally as the Eucharist bread, where the Eucharist bread was distributed. And somewhere in all this debate and reflection is the equivalent of an institution of the Eucharist, or at least a reflection on the institution of the Eucharist. This feeding is, if you like, the equivalent of John's Last Supper. And I think there are a few verses that are worth repeating as the chapter develops and comes towards its end, and these debates and arguments in Capernaum come to an end, just for us to remember what Jesus actually said. From verse 48, I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which anyone may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. Your ancestors ate manna and died, but whoever feeds on this bread will live forever. If we're to think of this as a Eucharistic reflection, and remember that John's church has been celebrating the Eucharist for 2 or 3 generations, probably for 40 years or more, it's worth comparing John's account with what Jesus says in the other accounts, the ones that we have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And for the most part, it's the words accompanying the cup that differ. Mark describes the cup as the blood of the covenant shed for many. Matthew expands on this by adding, for the forgiveness of sins. And that's the version that we use. Luke makes no mention of the covenant or sins, but says rather, take this and share it among yourselves. John makes no comment about the purpose of the wine, but rather of the bread. The bread, he says, is my flesh, which I give, and this is a key thing, I think, for the life of the world. This bread is my flesh, which I give for the life of the world. I think some of the importance of Jesus' statement here about eating and drinking on him and so on has been lost over the years in a debate dating back to the Protestant Reformation about transubstantiation and issues that were raised at that time. But there are two notable elements that we mustn't lose sight of. First of all, it reminds us of the Word made flesh, which right from the start is how we are introduced to Jesus in the Gospel. The Word made flesh. And second, the emphasis on Jesus' gift of himself, not just to a small group of disciples, as at the synoptic account in the Last Supper, in the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but rather for the life of the world. It's a fantastic phrase, that, for the life of the world. I sometimes wonder what difference it would make to our understanding of the Eucharist if we included those words in our liturgy, to reflect John rather more than we reflect Matthew. Imagine if we received the host, for example, not with words like, this is the body of Christ given for you, but rather, this is the body of Christ given for the life of the world. Consistently, the world is God's sphere of interest, according to John. Commentators vary widely on how they think John relates his community to the world. We noted last week that John uses the word for world, cosmos, 57 times. A case can be made for saying that John has sectarian tendencies. In other words, that the links between the community and the world are weak. A closed community shuts itself off from the world. Other commentators see John warning against a link with the world that is too strong. All the invocations to service. The most recent substantial commentary suggests that John is inviting his church to consider their boundaries, if you like, in both directions, and that he presents both the positive and negative aspects of the world in order that his church may navigate within them. The world is the place of sin and blindness, injustice and resistance to Jesus, but it's also the object of God's love, a place that he heroically enlightens, a place for which he wills life. And there's a very interesting description of God in this section as well, in verse 57. It occurs only here in the Bible, and God is described as the living Father, the living Father. Elsewhere, he's just described as Father many, many times, particularly in this Gospel. But the living Father, life and living just pervade this Gospel wherever you look. And it's been suggested that just as we can say God is love or God is spirit, John is encouraging us to say God is life. These titles that are ascribed to God or to Jesus play an important part in each of the Gospels. It's notable that one way in which John chapter 6 differs from the Synoptic Gospels account of the feeding of the 5,000 is that John's is the only Gospel to record a crowd response. And that response has echoes of the questions put to John in chapter 1 when they ask, are you the Messiah? Are you Elijah? Are you the prophet? And also in chapter 1, Nathanael's declaration, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel. These are the only kinds of category that allow the crowds to place Jesus. And we must have some sympathy with them. We usually understand things best when we can compare and contrast with something already known and understood. The problem for us is that these are not part of our culture. They don't help us to place Jesus because we have to have it explained to us from the outset what the Old Testament allusion actually referred to. We must always remember that John's intention is to show who Jesus is, part of that showing who he's not, or when the expectation is misplaced. For example, Jesus is not the kind of king who will exercise political power, and so when they want to make him king, he goes off into the hills on his own. But nevertheless, those titles are one part of John's strategy. And the Synoptic Gospels place great weight also on these titles ascribed to Jesus as a means of showing who he is. In particular, the only title Jesus uses of himself, Son of Man. It's the only title that ever appears on Jesus' lips in the Gospels to describe himself. The Synoptic Gospels interpret this in terms of a quotation from the book of Daniel, chapter 7, verse 13, which is a piece of apocalyptic writing. And in that passage, it says that one like a son of man comes on the clouds of heaven to the Ancient of Days with those who've kept faith that they might be vindicated. And that became a very popular kind of verse around the time of Jesus. The thinking about the Son of Man, the role of the Son of Man, developed until by the time of Jesus, it became identified with the one who was to usher in the kingdom, who would later come as judge and vindicator. And that seemed to be the way that the Synoptic Gospels were presenting Jesus. John follows the precedent of Son of Man being the only title Jesus uses of himself. In chapter 6, just in chapter 6, he uses it 3 times. But I fancy he may have a different interpretation, because you don't need to have the interpretation that's provided by Daniel 7:13. There are other possibilities. In Hebrew, there are very, very few adjectives. If you want to say somebody is a righteous man, you say he is a son of righteousness. If you want to say that somebody is just like David, you say he's a son of David, and so on. And perhaps in the good place to kind of begin to see this is in the prophet Ezekiel, where the prophet himself is addressed by God as Son of Man. Son of Man in those terms is just, if you like, an adjectival use. It's saying someone who is totally human, someone who is completely human, a human paradigm, if you like. If John were understanding Jesus' use of the term in that way, with his interest in creation, perhaps he might be pointing towards Jesus, as does Paul, as a kind of second Adam. And that would certainly chime with the account of the first Easter morning in John, where, you have Jesus as being mistaken for the gardener, just as Adam was called a gardener, and the whole thing taking place in a garden. But John does not rely on titles alone to show who Jesus is. More than the other Gospels, he identifies Jesus through testimony. Testimony of John the Witness, testimony of people like Nathaniel, testimony of people like the man born blind and Thomas and others, and notably John's own community. In chapter 1, verse 14, we read, "He made his home among us. We saw his glory, such glory as befits God's only Son, full of grace and truth." Well, when we hear that at Christmas, who do we think the we is? Well, it's John's church, obviously. Grace and truth being the 2 essential marks of God for Old Testament people. So Old Testament titles and testimony. But apart from that, John shows who Jesus is by the works he performs, which he describes as the works of God. We must always bear in mind that this gospel directed towards the reader. It's very much, the reader is very much in mind, and also towards John's contemporary congregation, trying to challenge them to ask new questions, trying to give some imaginative answers to the questions he hears them asking. And they don't want to know who Jesus was or what he meant to people lifetimes ago, or how people from other cultures understood and placed him. They, like us, want to know how they can see who Jesus is now. And John's answer to them lies in the Eucharist. John's also addressing one of the perennial problems of the church, one that we would recognize. The problem of the church in its relation with the world, one that we have to grapple with too. Neat phrases such as "in the world but not of the world" claim to say more than I think they do. A church that turns its back on the world has a very strong sense of identity, perhaps, but a very low evidence of relevance. A church which wholeheartedly engages with the world is able to serve the world, and so has an acknowledged relevance, but will struggle to find a sense of individual identity. The point is well demonstrated, I think, by another anecdote from Pauline Webb, this time from her autobiography. She recounts being at a public meeting in the 1960s, being addressed by the radical Roman Catholic priest Helder Camara, Archbishop of Recife in Brazil, and known as the friend of the poor. She writes, "It was clear that most of the audience at the meeting were not churchgoers. I remember his saying to this large, mainly jeans-clad audience, 'I don't know whether you would call yourselves Christians or not, but if you are standing alongside the poor, then in my estimation, you are standing alongside Jesus Christ.'" You see the problem there. Tremendous sense of relevance, but identity, anybody who stands alongside the poor, what's specific about Christians doing that? I wonder what we make of that. Well, we'll say more about identity next week, but that's an issue. In the Synoptic Gospels, the accounts of feeding are accompanied by accounts of healing and teaching, but here those details are stripped away, and the main focus here is on abundance, which is another theme of the Gospel. The details embedded in complicated accounts are sometimes missed, but it's fascinating that abundance should be a feature of Jesus' ministry. And once it's pointed out to you, you see it all the time. At Cana, there's an abundance of wine. Jesus' action produces 150 gallons of wine, which for a party already in full swing is far more than enough. They might disagree with me in Ferryside Rugby Club, but I think most people would agree. But to return to the theme of abundance, there is not only abundant wine, but abundant bread, as much as they wanted, it says in verse 11. There is much fruit that comes from a seed that dies in chapter 12. The house was filled with the perfume with which Mary anoints Jesus, again in chapter 12. The gift of the Spirit is measureless, we are told in chapter 3. Streams of living water flow as a result of believing in Jesus. Not a trickle, not just an ordinary kind of flow, but streams of living water in chapter 7. And Jesus' dead body even is treated with an exorbitant amount of spices, 1/2 hundredweight, 50 times as much as Mary had used to fill the whole house with perfume. And of course, Jesus doesn't just bring life, but he brings abundant life and eternal life. We, the reader, also, of course, know the source of the bread of life and the abundance of wine and the living water. In our own relationship with the world, the concept of abundance is controversial because the economic model on which the world operates and in which we live is one of scarcity. Controlling supply leads to stabilizing price and profit and a happy market. And it's interesting that a recently published book by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson called simply Abundance has caused a bit of a stir because it challenges that received wisdom. Actually, Jesus got there first 2,000 years ago, because the commercial world's view of reality and God's are different. Jesus joked, "Where shall we buy bread?" as if to highlight the difference. God too has an economy. The starving peoples of the world that Michael Burke drew our attention to do not appear always to benefit from our abundance, as we dump coffee and build up butter mountains and find sinful ways of limiting their access to the things that bring life. God's economy is based on abundance of love, abundance of bread, wine, and water, and of life. So what do we pick out from all this long chapter with these different themes, rich themes? What are our kind of reflection points, if you like? Well, first of all, perhaps just as John identified who Jesus is partly by testimony, we should see that churches also grow through testimony, through the testimony we receive that makes us curious, and the testimony that we give that makes others curious. Secondly, as a place of recognizing God, I think the Eucharist does have a special place for us that we have to own. And as the Emmaus Road story in Luke demonstrates, we meet God as we meet people in real life, standing alongside the poor, for example, but we recognize him in the Eucharist. We meet him in the world and recognize him in the Eucharist. Perhaps we might reflect on why John places his institution of the Eucharist here, where we might have expected to find it, he places the act of service of foot washing. And I think this is a reflection for people like us who have experienced Eucharist many times. Perhaps it's an encouragement to us to see the two acts as intimately connected, introduced as by the heading as they are in chapter 12. He loved them to the end. To recognize him in the Eucharist, we first perhaps meet him in people in real life, perhaps even in a fly-blown shop in Ethiopia in which bread was shared. Perhaps we too need to rethink that among the many alternatives we see between the world and God, economies also have a part to play. There is a divine economy based on abundance. And perhaps finally, we might wonder how our faith would change if we could regularly say and believe God is life.